Daily Words of God. In fact, God's disposition is open to everyone and is not hidden, because God has never consciously avoided any person and has never consciously sought to conceal himself to prevent people from knowing him or understanding him. God's disposition has always been to be open and to face each person candidly. In God's management, God does his work, facing everyone, and his work is done on every single person. As he does this work, he is continuously revealing his disposition and continuously using his essence, what he has and what he is, to guide and to provide for every single person. In every age and at every stage, regardless of whether the circumstances are good or bad, God's disposition is always open to each individual, and his possessions and being are always open to each individual, just as his life is constantly and unceasingly providing for and supporting mankind. Despite all of this, God's disposition remains hidden to some. Why? Because even though these people live within God's work and follow God, they have never sought to understand God, nor wanted to get to know God, let alone get closer to God. To these people, understanding God's disposition portends that their end is nigh. It means they are about to be judged and condemned by God's disposition. Therefore, they have never desired to understand God or his disposition, nor ever coveted a deeper understanding or knowledge of God's will. They do not seek to comprehend God's will through conscious cooperation. They just forever enjoy and never tire of doing the things they want to do. Believe in the God they want to believe in. Believe in the God that exists only in their imaginations, the God that exists only in their notions, and believe in a God that is inseparable from them in their daily lives. When it comes to the true God himself, they are completely dismissive and have no desire to understand him or to pay heed to him, and still less wish to grow closer to him. They are only using the words God expresses to adorn themselves, to package themselves. To them, this already makes them successful believers and people with faith in God inside their hearts. In their hearts, they are guided by their imaginations, their notions, and even their personal definitions of God. The true God himself, on the other hand, has absolutely nothing to do with them. Because were they to understand the true God himself, understand God's true disposition, and understand what God has and is, it would mean that their actions, their faith, and their pursuits would be condemned. That is why they are loath to understand God's essence, and are loath and unwilling to actively seek or pray to better understand God, better know God's will, and better understand God's disposition. They would rather God be something made up, something hollow and vague. They would rather God be someone who is exactly as they have imagined him, someone who can be at their beck and call, inexhaustible in supply and always available. When they want to enjoy God's grace, they ask God to be that grace. When they need God's blessing, they ask God to be that blessing. When faced with adversity, they ask God to embolden them, to be their rear shield. These people's knowledge of God is stuck within the ambit of grace and blessing. Their understanding of God's work, God's disposition, and God Himself is also merely restricted to their imaginings and letters and doctrines. But there are some people who are eager to understand God's disposition, want to genuinely see God Himself, and truly understand God's disposition and what He has and is. These people are in pursuit of the reality of truth and of salvation by God, and seek to receive conquest, salvation, and perfection by God. They use their hearts to read God's Word, use their hearts to appreciate every situation and every person, event, and thing God has arranged for them. And they pray and seek with sincerity. What they want to know most is God's will, and to understand most is God's true disposition and essence, that they may no longer offend God, and through their experiences may see more of God's loveliness and His true side. It is also so that a genuinely real God will exist inside their hearts, and so that God will have a place in their hearts, such that they will no longer be living amidst imaginings, notions, or vagueness. For these people, the reason they have a pressing desire to understand God's disposition and His essence is because God's disposition and essence are needed by mankind from moment to moment in the course of their experience. It is His disposition and essence that supply life throughout one's lifetime. Once they understand God's disposition, they will be able to better revere God, better cooperate with God's work, and be more considerate toward God's will, and do their duty to the best of their abilities. Such are the attitudes toward God's disposition held by two types of people. The first type does not want to understand God's disposition. Even though they say they want to understand God's disposition, get to know God Himself, see what God has and is, and genuinely appreciate God's will, deep down they would rather that God not exist. It is because this type of people consistently disobeys and resists God. They fight God for position in their own hearts, and often doubt or even deny God's existence. They do not want to let God's disposition or the real God Himself occupy their hearts. They only want to satisfy their own desires, imaginings, and ambitions. So these people may believe in God, follow God, and may also give up their families and jobs for Him. But they do not desist from their evil ways. Some even steal or squander offerings, or curse God in private, while others might use their positions to repeatedly testify about themselves, aggrandize themselves, and compete with God for people and status. They use various methods and measures to make people worship them, constantly trying to win people over and control them. Some even intentionally mislead people into thinking that they are God so that they can be treated like God. They would never tell someone that they have been corrupted, that they too are corrupt and arrogant, not to worship them, and that no matter how well they do, it is all due to God's exaltation, and that they are doing what they ought to anyway. Why do they not say these things? Because they are deeply afraid of losing their place in people's hearts. This is why such people never exalt God and never bear witness to God, as they have never tried to understand God. Can they know God without understanding Him? Impossible. Thus, while the words in the topic God's work, God's disposition, and God Himself may be simple, they have different meanings to each person. For someone who often disobeys God, resists God, and is hostile toward God, the words portend condemnation. Whereas someone who pursues the reality of the truth and often comes before God to seek God's will take to such words as a fish to water. So there are those among you who, when they hear talk of God's disposition and God's work, start to get a headache. Their hearts grow full of resistance, and they become extremely uncomfortable. But there are others among you who think, this topic is exactly what I need, because this topic is so beneficial to me. It is something that cannot be missing from my life experience. It is the crux of the crux, the foundation of faith in God, and something mankind cannot abandon. For all of you, this topic might seem both near and far, unknown yet familiar. But no matter what, this is a topic that everyone must listen to, must know, and must understand. No matter how you deal with it, no matter how you look upon it, or how you understand it, the importance of this topic cannot be ignored.